The Hosdurga-Holalkere Man-Eater by Kenneth Anderson. Recording by Apratim Viraj Singh. Holalkere is the second largest town in the district of Chitaldurg, which itself is the northernmost district of the native state of Mysore and borders on the neighbouring division of Bellary in the province of Madras towards the northeast and on the province of Bombay to the northwest. It has long been the center of sporadic instances of man-eating by tigers, and there is good evidence to believe that the locality is the habitat of tigers which have inherited a taste for human flesh. About 10 years ago, several instances of human kills were reported in this area, which was thrown open by advertisement in the Mysore Gazette to the free shooting of tigers without the requirement of a big game license. At that time, there was a very sporting couple in Bangalore, Angus Mactavish and his wife, who were keen on killing a tiger, particularly a man-eater, and suggested to me that we make a party of 3 and spend some 4 weeks in the attempt. Accordingly, we motored in Mactavish's car from Bangalore to Chitaldurg, the capital town of the district of the same name, where we called on to the district forest officer to obtain all possible information about the most recent kills and where they had taken place. This officer was most cooperative and informed us that the existing man-eaters beat extended from the very outskirts of Chitaldurg town itself to the town of Holalkere, which lay some 10 miles away in a southwesterly direction and thence southwards 9 miles to the small village of Hosdurga, where the 2 recent human victims had been taken. From Hosdurga, the line of the tiger's activities was reported to proceed eastwards to the borders of the huge reservoir of Marikanave, or Vani Vilas, as it is sometimes known, 5 miles away, an enormous lake inhabited by huge fish and crocodile. All along the shores of this lake and back northwards in a rough line to Chitaldurg town itself. Indeed, he assured us the man-eater had been reported among the ruins of an old fort which crested a small hill named Yogi Mutt, rising abruptly to the south of the town. I knew that the environs of this old fort had long been frequented by stray bears and panthers, with an occasional tiger, but after further consultation, it was decided to move on to Holalkere and Hosdurga, where we would establish our center of operations as circumstances warranted after hearing local reports. Leaving early next morning, we reached Holalkere within an hour, where the usual condition of nervous excitement and fear that accompanies the proximity of a man-eater always prevail. We were told all sorts of stories, some of them completely contradictory, and from this mass of statements, we were able to gather only that the man-eater was a very astute animal, wandered everywhere, and had the knack of appearing unexpectedly at most unlikely places. A prevailing rumor was that it very often frequented a vast plantation of date palms, interspersed with the dense undergrowth of lantana that bordered both sides of the road leading from Holalkere to Hosdurga. This plantation commenced just beyond the outskirts of Holalkere itself. We were told that its pug marks could be seen almost daily on the road and were advised to motor up and down the 9 miles that connected the 2 places all night, when we would surely meet the man-eater sooner or later, particularly when passing the palm grove. Accordingly, we set out at 7 p.m. that night and had left Holalkere a mile behind when the tall, spreading leaves of the palm trees came into view, the close array of their spiky trunks being entirely hidden from view at the base by a dense and continuous stretch of lantana undergrowth. From this point we motored onwards at a snail's pace, flashing the spotlight in all directions, while the gleaming headlights pierced the road before us. Proceeding in this fashion for a half a mile, we came upon what looked like a very black, hairy man who had climbed a palm tree some 15 feet high to the right of us, and was busy gulping down bunches of the small, yellow, half-ripe palm dates that hung in clusters from among the spiky fronds. We approached closer and stopped the car, when this strange man began to climb down. Descending halfway, however, he stopped and looked around at us and my companions were surprised to discover that their strange man was a sloth bear, disturbed at a feast of dates. I had known from the onset that it was a bear, but had wanted my companions to learn for themselves. With her .3005 Springfield rifle, Mrs. Mactavish brought off a good shot from the car, dropping the creature to the ground with a resounding thud. We then motored on to Hosdurga without seeing a thing, returned to Holalkere, and twice more backwards and forwards in each direction, seeing nothing beyond a hyena near the carcass of the bear on our final return journey. Fearing, therefore, that if we left the carcass there any longer it would be destroyed, by Herculean effort the three of us managed to hoist the heavy body onto the space between the engine and the front mudguard of Mac's car. Although long, the hair of a bear is slippery, and it was most difficult to keep a firm hold of any part of the animal, which began to slip out of one's fingers as soon as its weight was lifted. Next morning we had tea at the traveller's bungalow at Holalkere, together with steaming porridge and bacon and eggs, which Mrs. Mactavish prepared in excellent fashion. Then, after skinning the bear, we decided to move on to Hosdurga to obtain first-hand information about the two latest human kills. Traversing the date palm plantation in daylight enabled us to realize fully the denseness of the surrounding, all-enveloping lantana, which it was impossible to fathom the night before, and of what little hope there was to see or shoot a tiger in such a place. At Hosdurga, we were told the story of the two earlier tragedies. The first had happened some 3 weeks before. A girl, aged 11 years, and incidentally a distant relation of the Amildar of the Taluk, was living with her parents in a house on the outskirts of the village. At 8 p.m., she had gone outside, probably to answer a call of nature, and had never been seen again, nor had any cry or sound explaining her fate been heard. Anxious about her failure to return, her parents followed with a lantern, but nothing was seen of her, nor were any marks evident on the hard ground. Becoming increasingly alarmed, they aroused the village, and in about 2 hours a party of some 50 persons, armed with lanterns, staves, hatchets, and 2 muzzle-loading guns, went forth to search for the girl. Nothing could they find, however, in the darkness that night. Next day, further efforts were made, and a few fragments of tattered underwear were found entangled among thorns a half a mile away. Nothing was ever found of the remains of that little girl. The second kill had occurred 12 days ago, in the following fashion. The reservoir of Marikanave lay some 5 miles away to the east. About halfway to its shore, and crossing the track that led there, was a tiny brook that formed, close to the trackside, a small but fairly deep pool. This pool was used by 2 brothers of the village, who were professional dhobies or washermen, as a convenient place in which to wash clothes. They possessed 3 donkeys, which were used for conveying the washing to and from the pool. That evening, they had finished their task at about 5 p.m., loaded the donkeys, and were returning homewards. These animals, being their only stock in trade, so to say, were taken particular care of, one brother walking in advance, followed by the 3 donkeys in line, and the other brother bringing up the rear. They were a mile from Hosdurga when a tiger leapt from concealment, seized the leading man, and disappeared with him before he could utter a sound. His brother, in the rear, seeing what had happened, lost his head and bolted back towards the pool which they had just left. When 8 p.m. came and neither the donkeys nor the brothers had turned up at Hosdurga, the 2 wives became alarmed and spread agitation throughout the village. By 10 p.m., a second search party of some 70 men, armed with lanterns, staves, and of course the 2 muzzle-loading guns, set forth in search. In due course, they came upon one of the 3 missing donkeys, complacently sitting in the middle of the track, the bundle of washing still tied to its back. Further on, a furlong short of the pool, they came upon the man who had turned tail and fled. He had fainted with terror at finding himself alone in the jungle after seeing what had happened to his brother, and was in a state of collapse. He frothed at the mouth, and his eyes were turned upwards. It was nearly an hour before he was in a condition to whisper hoarsely the terrifying news. Together with him, the party then returned to the spot where the attack had taken place, when a half-hearted attempt was made to search for the missing man. Naturally, it proved unsuccessful, and it was decided to return next day. Accordingly, daylight found the party back again, when extensive search revealed bits of tattered clothing, a blood trail, and finally the remains of the unfortunate man, which had been 3/4 eaten during the night. All that was left was his head, 2 arms, 1 whole leg, and just the remaining foot, which were duly gathered together and brought back to Hosdurga for cremation. Contentedly grazing a furlong from the track were the 2 remaining pack donkeys. An additional piece of news was now offered, in that 4 days ago a bullock cart with a double yoke of oxen proceeding to Holalkere had been attacked by a tiger 3 miles from Hosdurga at about 3 p.m. In this instance, the driver had jumped out of the cart and escaped, returning by a circuitous route through the forest to the village. A party had gone out next morning to find the cart, with 1 bull still yoked to it standing by the roadside. Hardly 50 yards away lay what was left of the other bull, which the tiger had killed, wrenched free of the yoke, carried this distance, and then eaten in full view of its unfortunate companion. Along with all this news, we were also told that a rival party of 2 huntsmen were in occupation of the small 1-room traveller's bungalow of which the village of Hosdurga boasted, having arrived by car some 5 days earlier. This indeed cramped our style, as it would not be cricket to commence attempts at shooting the man-eater when the other sportsmen had preceded us. Furthermore, in keeping with the good old adage of too many cooks spoil the broth, too many huntsmen generally achieve nothing beyond frightening off their quarry, that is, if they do not in the meantime accidentally shoot each other. It was nearing 10 o'clock by the time we had gathered all this information, and we were just debating the advisability of returning to Holalkere when the 2 sportsmen in question turned up. They were both youngsters and, although inexperienced, were exceedingly keen on the game. Introducing themselves, they repeated all the news we had already heard, and added that they had tied out a buffalo bait for the last 2 nights in the vicinity of where the washerman had been eaten. Nothing had happened during the first night, and their party of coolies had gone out that morning to ascertain how the bait had fared the previous night. We wished these gentlemen the best of luck, and told them we would return to Holalkere so as not to be in their way. They would not hear of the idea, however, and considered our action to be a personal affront, and begged us to join them in the bungalow till the next morning, when they stated they were due to return to Bellary, where they had come from. In the midst of all this friendly talk, their party of coolies arrived to announce that the bait had been killed and half eaten the night before. Those 2 boys were the acme of hospitality, and offered us a chance of sitting over their bait. Needless to say, of course, we would not consent to this. After a combined lunch, we set out with them to see the kill and render any possible assistance. We found the boys had chosen rather unwisely in tying their bait in a region scattered with boulders. Moreover, they had not secured the animal properly, with the result that the tiger had broken the tethering rope and dragged its victim partly behind a rock and completely out of view of the tree in which they had intended to construct their machan. To the spot where the kill had been dragged were 2 possible lines of approach by the man-eater, if in fact it was a man-eater that had killed the bait. The first being from the direction of the track where the washerman had been killed, and the other from a hillock lying a 1/4 mile away, approximately southeast of the kill. 2 separate boulders, among the many that lay around, were so positioned as to command each view of these possible lines of approach, as well as of the kill and of each other. The 2 sportsmen therefore elected to sit, one behind each of these boulders. I venture to suggest that, as the adversary they were dealing with might also turn out to be the man-eater, it would be safer if they sat on top of the boulders behind a concealing wall of thorns. They did not agree to this, however, and decided to sit on the ground with their backs to the boulders. Roughly sheltering them behind a few cut, thorny bushes, we left these dowdy lads by 4 p.m. to return to the bungalow. I was anxious about their welfare and would have liked to linger within calling distance to render help if necessary, but finally decided that my presence might frighten the tiger off and my motive might be misunderstood. Little did we know that afternoon that our hearty good wishes for a lucky night were the last words that any of our party would utter to one of those fine boys. We spent the evening in the bungalow, drinking tea, smoking and chatting, while interviewing as many villagers as possible to gain additional information. A strong wind was blowing from the southwest, so that it would be impossible to hear any rifle shot fired by the two lads who were over a mile away. We had an early dinner, and Mactavish and his wife then turned in. I decided, however, to sit on the veranda and listen to any jungle sounds I might possibly hear. It was nearing 11 o'clock. The village had been silent for the past hour, and I was thinking of going to bed, when I heard a peculiar noise, which I soon recognized as running, stumbling footsteps in the distance. Realizing that my intuitive fear of impending trouble, experienced so strongly earlier that evening, had not misled me, I hastily grabbed my rifle and torch and ran out to meet the runner. It turned out to be Ince, the elder of the two sportsmen. His clothes were tattered. He was lathered in sweat and staggered like a drunken man, looking behind him continually as he stumbled forward. Supporting him by the shoulder, I asked what had become of his companion. The poor boy was so exhausted that he could hardly speak, but he finally gasped out the awful words, Tiger got him. Carried him off. Oh, and began to weep on my shoulder like a child. I hurried him to the bungalow, where I awoke Mactavish and his wife. We gave Ince a stiff dose of brandy, laid him down, and covered him with 2 blankets, for he was now shaking like an aspen tree with the reaction that had set in. Then, with Mrs. Mactavish chafing his hands, we impatiently waited for his story, and it was indeed an extraordinary tale. He had sat below the rock, commanding the approach from the track, while his companion, Todd, behind the other rock, commanded the approach from the hillock. Shortly before dark, Ince thought he had seen a long, reddish object move in the bushes quite some distance away and beyond Todd, where the land sloped gently down from the hillock. Of course, he had no means of apprising Todd of what he had seen, and knew that the latter did not know about it, as that area was hidden from his view by the very boulder below which he, Todd, was sitting. Ince had continued to watch the bushes, but had seen nothing thereafter. Then darkness fell, and the hours passed wearily by until about 10 p.m. The kill was not visible in the shadows, although the stars shed a faint light that enabled Ince to see in his immediate vicinity. Suddenly, Ince heard a faint thud, a slight dragging noise, and then the unmistakable sound of crunching bones. Guessing that the tiger had returned and was eating its kill, Ince waited a while to give his companion a chance to take the shot, knowing, as he did, that the kill was equidistant, if not a little nearer to Todd, who must also be hearing the sound of the tiger feeding. Nothing happened, however, and nobody will know why Todd remained inactive. Then the thought came to Ince that perhaps his companion had fallen asleep, and with that he decided to take the shot himself. Aligning his rifle in the direction of the kill, he pressed the button of his rifle torch, the bright beam immediately revealing a huge tiger devouring the remains of the buffalo. At the same time, there was a piercing scream from Todd, a horrible growl from that direction, a slight scuffling noise, another half-muffled cry, and then silence. In the meantime, Ince had shifted the beam of his rifle torch from the tiger and his kill to the rock, at the base of which Todd had been sitting earlier that evening. The last glimpse he had of the former was as it bounded away from the remains of the buffalo into the concealing shrubs. Of Todd, he could see no sign. Calling to his friend repeatedly, Ince rushed blindly to the spot where he had been sitting. Todd's rifle, water bottle, and half-empty packet of sandwiches lay on the ground, but he was nowhere to be seen. Becoming hysterical with the realization that his friend had been taken by the man-eater, Ince floundered about and attempted to search the jungle for him, only to lose his own way. Demented with grief and growing more desperate each minute, he rushed aimlessly about when, by sheer good luck, he succeeded in stumbling on the track leading to Hosdurga, up which he had run top speed. It was now clear from Ince's story that we had two tigers to deal with, one an avowed cattle lifter, and the other an even more determined man-eater. They were probably a pair, male and female, although this was not necessarily so. Never in my life had I met such an unusual combination. The possibility that they were two grown cubs from the same litter, one of which had acquired man-eating tendencies, appeared to be ruled out by Ince's description of the cattle lifter as a huge tiger, and by no means half-grown. On the other hand, the man-eater nobody had seen. Within 15 minutes, we aroused the village, and assembled some 20 rather reluctant helpers, although the owners of the two muzzle-loaders were again to the fore, with lanterns, sticks, staves, and matchets. Mrs. Mactavish insisted on coming too, and so did Ince, although he was almost spent. The search party, together with Mactavish and myself, were soon at the rock from which Todd had been taken. Casting around, it was not long before we found an odd rubber-soled shoe that had fallen from his left foot. From the place where we found it, we judged the tiger was making with its burden towards the little hillock from which it had apparently come. Pressing forward with all possible speed, we eventually reached a spot where the animal had first laid its victim down. From here, probably alarmed by the noise created by Ince in his shouting and floundering, it had moved on. As usual, a blood trail now commenced, which led us to the base of the hillock, which had followed towards the right-hand side. Led by Mactavish and myself, and keeping close together for fear of unexpected attack, we persevered in our search. But it was 3:30 a.m. before we came upon what remained of poor Fred Todd. The tiger had eaten quite half of him, and it was a ghastly sight. A severe reaction now overtook Ince, who began to retch, wept, and finally collapsed. It was past 6 a.m. that terrible day before we managed to get the remains to Hosdurga, together with the now totally incapable Ince. We put what was left of Fred Todd into Mactavish's car, while I drove Ince in what had been his poor friend's motor, and we reached Chitaldrug by 9 o'clock. Here, Ince was taken into the local fund hospital, and we spent the major part of the day on the tedious official inquiries that follow an incident of this kind, so that it was almost sunset before we returned to Hosdurga and to a very empty, silent traveller's bungalow. We fell asleep that night, sad and disheartened, but grimly determined on revenge. Mrs. Mactavish in particular had endured the nervous strain of the past 20 hours in heroic fashion, and was of untold assistance throughout the whole time. Early next morning found us back at the scene of the tragedy, where we spent the next 3 or 4 hours in piecing together the evidence. The ground was hard, as no rain had fallen for several weeks, and it was impossible to find an imprint of the man-eater to enable us to determine its size and sex. Ince's description of the cattle killer led us to think it was a male. The man-eater was therefore, in all probability, a female, although, as I have said earlier, this was not necessarily so. Finding nothing in the vicinity, We followed the trail once more to the spot where we had found Todd's body, but nowhere could we see a solitary pug mark of the killer. We even attempted to look further, but the hard ground hid its secret well, and in spite of all our efforts, the man-eater's size and sex remained a secret. During our absence at Chitaldrug, the vultures had completely demolished what had remained of the buffalo kill. We now had to make a fresh start in our operations. After due consultation, it was decided to secure a fresh buffalo bait close to the original track where the washerman had been killed. Mactavish could sit over it, while I determined to lie prone on top of one of the boulders close to where Todd had been taken. Our plan was roughly this. Should the two tigers move in company, the cattle lifter would kill the bait when, in all probability, although a man-eater, the other tiger would not be able to resist the temptation of a feast and would also join in. That would provide Mac with the shot. On the other hand, even if it did not join in, the man-eater would probably be in the vicinity, and as the rock on which I was going to lie was in a direct line with the hillock and along the direction of his approach the previous day, I hoped to be able to hear and see him if he should pass near me. As there were no trees along the track where Mac was to sit up, we solved the problem of protection by scooping a shallow hole in the earth, over which we decided to place an inverted sugarcane pan. These pans resemble huge saucers and are some 6 to 8 feet in diameter, 18 inches deep, and beaten from sheet iron about 1/8 of an inch thick. They are used throughout India as containers in which to melt the juice from the sticks of cane sugar previously gathered by means of crushing through a press. This juice is boiled in the pan and becomes a golden brown liquid, which is then allowed to cool and solidify before being cut into 4-inch squares to form what is known as jaggery or brown sugar. Jaggery is the only form of sugar used in southern Indian villages, white sugar being unknown, and practically every village in any fertile area possesses its own cane sugar plantations with accompanying sugarcane pans. We had already seen a few of them in Hosdurga. It was not long before we were back from the village with one of these pans carried by 6 men, a length of camouflaged tarpaulin which Mac had brought in his car, and the other necessities for a night sit-up. This pan we inverted over the shallow hole we had dug, and was raised from the ground at 4 points by rocks so as to provide a 6-inch gap for vision and ventilation, and a space through which to shoot. Over the pan we spread the camouflaged tarpaulin, covering this again with a sprinkling of sand dug from the shallow hole, and with a few thorns, cut bushes, leaves, etc., to give it a realistic appearance. We made a good job of the whole effort, so that the pan looked no more from a fair distance than a small hump in the ground. A further complication now arose as Mac was about to get in, when his wife insisted on sitting with him. We both did our best to dissuade her, but she was adamant, with the result that finally the men and I raised the pan at one end, allowed the Mactavishes to creep in, and then rearranged the whole affair. Actually, I felt it was quite safe inside, the inverted pan providing a sort of armored turret. The bait was then tied, and before going off to the rock on which I was to lie, it was agreed that in case of need we were to signal each other by 3 sharp whistles. I ascended my rock by 5 p.m., settled myself comfortably, and lay prone to await events. I recollect that the stone was uncomfortably hot after having been exposed to direct sunlight throughout the day. There was no sound as the hours dragged by, and the forest seemed empty of any form of life. Even the familiar night jar, welcome at the moment, was absent. The silence was deep and complete, and the stars twinkled down on me in eerie stillness. I fell to thinking of poor Fred Todd and of what had happened to him. Midnight passed, when suddenly I heard a clear whistle, twice repeated. It was the agreed signal from Mac, and wondering what had happened to ail him, I slid down from the rock, switched on the torch, and cautiously approached the place where he and his wife were stationed. I came upon them standing beside the buffalo bait which was alive and untouched. To one side lay the pan that they had overturned in getting out, and this is what they told me. They had seen and heard nothing till about midnight, when Mrs. Mac, sitting directly behind her husband who was facing the buffalo, thought she heard a faint sigh or moan behind her. Glancing around slowly and endeavoring to look through the space between the pan and the ground, she had at first noticed nothing. Then she observed what appeared to be a boulder, as big as a bathtub, just 6 feet away. Remembering that there had been no boulder there earlier in the evening, she had brought her head closer to the opening and was horrified to see a tiger lying on the ground on its belly, its forelegs stretched out in front, intently meeting her gaze. Stifling the gasp of surprised horror that almost escaped her, she endeavored by vigorous nudging to attract her husband's attention. From his position, Mac had seen nothing, and it was almost impossible for him to turn around, for the hole that had originally been dug for one person was too small to allow for the movement of two. Sensing by her continued nudges that something unusual was afoot, Mac had then made a determined effort to turn himself, with the result that the muzzle of his extended rifle contacted the edge of the pan with a slight metallic clang. There was a loud woof and a thud as the tiger jumped lightly over the contraption. Knowing that they had been discovered and that no purpose was likely to be served by remaining any longer, they then summoned me by the agreed signal. To remain longer was useless, so we decided to return to the bungalow at Hosdurga, leaving the bait where it was for the night, pending a decision on some other plan. Early next morning, I dispatched a party of men to bring in the bait. They returned with the astounding news that the animal had been killed and entirely devoured. Hastening to the spot, we found their story true. Practically nothing remained of our bait but its head and hooves. Close examination of the ground revealed that 2 tigers had partaken of the meal in close proximity. Moreover, to the overturned sugarcane pan and tarpaulin sheet lying in a heap nearby, both of which had failed to frighten the beasts away. The deduction to be drawn from this latest development was, therefore, that our man-eater was also a cattle-eater when opportunity offered. Alternatively, there was the possibility that 3 tigers were operating in the vicinity, a man-eater and 2 cattle killers. For the following night, we decided to work to the same plan, tying a fresh bait a quarter of a mile along the same track, and to plant the sugarcane pan beside it as before, this time making the shallow hole large enough to accommodate both Mac and myself. Mrs. Mac was very reluctantly consented to remain at the bungalow. The camouflaged tarpaulin was spread over the pan under a layer of loose sand and rubble with grass, thorns, and small cut bushes to give the whole a very realistic appearance of a small rise in the ground. Mac and I sat back to back, rifles ready, with Mac facing the bait. On this occasion, we also provided for a slightly greater aperture to allow more shooting space by using larger stones at the 4 opposite ends of the pan. Mac and I sat thus throughout 3 nights in succession, but we saw and heard nothing. But about 10 o'clock on the 4th morning, while we were having a nap at the bungalow, news arrived that a man had been killed a mile from Holalkere in the same date palm grove where we had shot the bear some days earlier and almost at the same spot. Hastening there by car, we were both disgusted and annoyed to find that the relations of the latest victim had in the meantime removed his body for cremation, so that we lost the chance of sitting up over this human kill to which the tiger might possibly have returned. We then procured another buffalo bait at Holalkere and tied it within 50 yards of the place where the man had been killed. A convenient tree overlooked the road at this spot, and on this tree I erected a machan. As Mac was feeling a bit seedy and was tired after his vigil of 4 consecutive nights, he decided to rest on that occasion, and I sat up alone. Again, nothing happened, and 6 a.m. found me trudging the mile towards Holalkere with mixed feelings of tiredness, disappointment, and disgust. Arriving there, I sent men out to bring back the bait. They came running back in half an hour with the news that, as they were about to untie the animal, a tiger had growled in the jungle within a few yards of them. They had then rushed pell-mell back to Holalkere, leaving the buffalo where it was. Jumping into the car, we hastened to the spot and were truly surprised to find our bait still alive. This was very unexpected, as we were certain that the tiger, or tigers, would have killed the buffalo as soon as the fleeing men were out of sight. Taking a chance, I went up into the machan at once, instructing Mac to return to Holalkere. There was just a possibility, I felt, that the tiger might turn up. Nothing happened, and as at 1 p.m. I was feeling both hungry and sleepy, I then got down, untied the bait, and walked along with it to Holalkere. That night, we retied the bait at the same spot, and I sat up once again. Mac and his wife went to Hosdurga in the car and sat up together under the sugarcane pan beside the bait we had left there in the spot where he and I had sat up for 3 consecutive nights. Again, nothing happened, and by 6:30 a.m., they came along in the car from Hosdurga, picked me up, and proceeded to the bungalow at Holalkere, where we all went to sleep after lunch. At 4 p.m., we were awakened by a great hullabaloo. Restoring some order in the throng that had collected in the veranda, we came to learn that a company of 12 men had left Holalkere before noon to drive a herd of cattle to Chitaldrug for market, intending to cover the intervening distance long before sunset. About 3 miles from Holalkere, one of the cattle had strayed from the main road for a short distance of perhaps 25 yards. A man who had gone to drive it back was attacked by a tiger that had evidently been flanking the party and was in hiding in the very bushes that bordered the roadside. Being cut off from retreat to his friends on the road, he had rushed up a rock that happened to be nearby. The whole scene had occurred in full view of the party, all of whom stood huddled together in a bunch and failed to render help of any sort, so stricken were they with fear. The tiger had then sprung up the rock and fastened the claws of a forepaw in the man's thigh, attempting to pull him down. The man, continuing to scream for help, had clung with both hands to the branch of a tree that overhung the rock to save himself from being dragged down. The first attack failed, and the tiger slipped backwards to earth, its claws practically peeling the skin from the man's thigh till it hung like the skin of a partially stripped banana. Becoming infuriated, and no doubt urged on by the sight of human blood, the tiger then made a second attempt, this time fastening both its forepaws squarely in the body of the man and dragging him from his feeble hold. Once it got him down from the rock, it had seized him by the neck and bounded off into the forest. It was a matter of minutes to reach the spot by car. Evidence of the fresh tragedy was available in abundance, the bits of human skin and fingernails embedded in the broken branch testifying to the intensity of that last desperate hold. Spattered blood could be seen everywhere, and there was a distinct trail where the victim had been carried away. We followed this up all in haste, the trail leading downwards to a valley of dense jungle. It was past 5 p.m., and we had exactly an hour to find the body before dark. Soon we discovered the usual pieces of tattered clothing, then a dark pool of blood, where the tiger had deposited his victim, only to go on downwards into the dark valley. Perhaps 6 furlongs had been covered in this way when we came upon a low outcrop of rock interspersed with bushes. I was surprised to find that the tiger had not yet stopped to begin its meal, as this was a quiet and secluded spot, but hardly had the thought entered my mind when a distinct growl came from behind a large rock, followed by the sound of a small stone being dislodged as the tiger bounded away before we could even see it. Rounding the bend, we encountered the corpse, weltering in its own blood and about 1/3 devoured. Time was passing. There was no suitable tree nearby, and the only possible place to sit up was on top of the largest of the neighboring rocks, which was about 12 feet high. This rock rose steeply on 3 sides and was fairly safe against a tiger's spring, but unfortunately it sloped on the 4th side, and still more unfortunate was the fact that this sloping side did not face the dead man, but was a little more than a right angle from the body's position. This meant that if I lay on top of the rock, I would have to keep a careful watch in 2 directions, namely on the corpse below me to the left and onto the sloping side of rock to my right, for fear that the tiger might make a sudden rush up this and be on top of me before I was aware of it. As I have said, I considered my rear, which faced one of the sides where the rock dropped steeply, fairly safe against a sudden spring, to do which the tiger would have to leap a clean 12 feet to the top of the rock. If he did not clear that height in one jump, he would have no hold at all and would slip backwards, which would give me ample time to shoot. No tiger, in my opinion, would risk such an uncertain jump. Screening the top of the rock on the sloping side with a few small stones and bushes, I scrambled up, and telling the Max to spend part of the night in driving up and down between Holalkere and Hosdurga in the hope of meeting the tiger on the road in case it had abandoned the kill. With the departure of my friends and the villagers, I was now alone, with the mangled remains that were strewn on the ground below me. The hours passed on, while I kept an intent watch on the sloping rock to my right. The jungle beyond was hidden in darkness and appeared just a blur in the hazy background against which it was impossible to distinguish any animal smaller than an elephant. In the gloom, the corpse to my left could no longer be seen. At about 10 o'clock, a sambhar belled in the distant forest a mile away. This was followed by a tiger calling, which was answered shortly by another tiger in the direction of the road from which we had come. The complexity of the situation was now fully apparent, as I thought the matter over during those silent hours. We had at least 2 tigers operating in the area, possibly 3. Of these, one was a man-killer, daring, cruel, and ruthless. The other was a cattle lifter, equally daring and cunning by nature. But this did not necessarily mean that either of these tigers refrained from indulging in both habits when occasion presented. Again, there was the possibility of a 3rd tiger operating in the district, which might itself be a man-killer or a cattle lifter, or both. So far, due to the dry weather and hard ground, we had been prevented from picking up any distinguishing pug marks to be able to identify these various animals. The tigers had now ceased calling, and all was silent again in the surrounding forest, except for the chirping of the tree crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the periodic sound of a gust of wind bending the tops of the giant trees, a sound like the roar of a distant sea. Then, suddenly, and without warning or premonition, it happened. There was a thud against the rock behind me, a violent scratching and scraping against the stone, mingled with a snarling growl, and then another thud as the tiger fell backwards to the ground. Before I could turn and peer over the edge of the rock, he was gone. The man-eater had done the unexpected thing. Having somehow become aware of my presence, he had stalked me from behind and attempted a sheer leap of 12 feet to the top of the rock where I was lying. By good fortune, he had failed to make it by a few inches. I spent the rest of the night sitting up and fully alert, but nothing occurred. I waited till the sun had risen high next morning before venturing to scramble down and return to the road, as I feared the tiger, having discovered my presence, might be lying in ambush for me, but again my luck held out, and I reached the road in safety, where Mactavish came for me in the car in a few minutes, having himself spent a fruitless night in driving up and down the road between Holalkere and Hosdurga. Immediately upon arrival at the bungalow, I instructed a party of men to return to the human remains and cover them with branches to protect them against vultures, as I intended to set up again on the rock that night. These men were just setting out, However, when the relatives of the dead man arrived from his village and demanded the remains for cremation, I attempted to persuade them to allow the body to stay where it was for another day, but they were adamant, and so any opportunity that might have presented itself of avenging the death of that poor man that night was lost to us through the obstinacy of his relations. 2 hours later, a party of men arrived from Hosdurga to inform us that our bait, which had been left tied near the sugar-cane pan for the past week, had at last been killed. Evening found Mac and myself sitting under the pan, and about midnight we heard a tiger moving around in the vicinity by the intermittent low grunt it was making every now and then. We waited anxiously for it to come on to the kill, but this it would not do, and kept circling the area for the best part of 3/4 of an hour. Quite obviously, it had discovered our presence near the kill. A brave but foolhardy idea now entered Mac's mind, which was that he should get up and walk away to give the tiger the impression that we had left and that his kill was alone. He hoped it would then approach and I could deal with it myself. The plan was likely to meet with success, as you will remember that this is exactly what happened on the last occasion we had left the pan and our bait. At the same time, it was a very dangerous thing for Mac to do, in view of the fact that the tiger hovering near might be the man-eater itself, or might be accompanied by the man-eater, as on an earlier occasion. It took me quite 30 minutes to drive the idea from the head of that stubborn but magnificently brave Scotsman that to venture out in the dark jungle with a man-eater about would be to sign his own death warrant. In the meantime, the tiger continued to prowl around, but went off in the early hours of the morning, and we returned to the little bungalow at Hosdurga after yet another night of disappointment. Nothing happened the 2 following days, the nights of which we spent driving up and down between Hosdurga-Holalkere and Chitaldrug, flashing the spotlight in the hope of meeting one of the tigers on the road. Early on the morning of the 3rd day, a party of Lumbini woodcutters reported that they had been camped in the forest 4 miles away the previous night in the protection of a huge campfire around which they had drawn their 5 carts in a rough circle and within which they and their 5 bullocks were sheltering. In the dead of the night, the fire having burned low, a tiger had crept past the carts and attacked one of the bulls. The rest of the bulls had stampeded around, awakening the men who had shouted and thrown firebrands at the tiger. It had then decamped. The bull had been bitten through the neck and severely scratched as well, but it was alive. At dawn, they had come on to Hosdurga with 4 carts and the injured bullock, abandoning the 5th cart, which the bullock was too badly hurt to haul. One of these Lumbinis, who had been in the area from childhood and knew the forest like the palm of his hand, mentioned that 6 miles away, in the heart of the forest, was a small stream leading to a clear pool surrounded by sloping rocks under giant trees. It was in this locality, he asserted, that the tigers had their permanent abode. Now that it was summer, they spent the hours of noonday heat in this cool retreat, and invariably one or other of them would drink at this pool in the evening before setting out on its hunt for prey, or in the early hours of the morning after returning from the hunt. This man evidently knew what he was talking about, for intimate speech with him revealed that he was a poacher and a bootlegger, to wit, who made quite a lot of money by illicitly distilling in the fastnesses of the forest a very potent liquor called aruk from the bark of the babool tree. Very few people knew about this place, and those who did dared not venture there for fear of the tigers. The upshot of the conversation was that it was agreed Mac and I would leave with him after lunch that day to spend the evening, night, and following morning at this pool. 3 p.m. found us at the spot, and a more likely tiger hunt I have seldom seen. The pool itself was a small one, entirely surrounded by sloping rock, but the banks of the tiny stream that fed it amply revealed the presence of tigers by repeated tracks that led down to it and crossed it. A rough survey of these tracks indicated the pug marks of two separate animals, a large male and an adult female. From the repeated reports of its large size, the former was in all likelihood the cattle lifter, leaving now definite cause for suspicion that his companion, the female, might be the man-eater, unless, of course, there was a third tiger in the party. A wild mango tree overhung the pool at almost the spot where the stream ran in, and on the lower branches of this tree, at about 15 feet, we put up my portable charpoy machan, which we had brought along with us for just such an occasion, carried by the Lumbini. 4:30 p.m. found all three of us sitting on this machan, it being dangerous to send the Lumbini away by himself for fear of the man-eater. On account of the overhanging big trees, it was pitch dark by 7 o'clock, nor did any animals visit the vicinity. Undoubtedly, they stayed away because of the habitual proximity of the kings of the jungle. The hours dragged by in solemn silence, disturbed once or twice by the distant calls of sambhar and kakad, or barking deer. It must have been past 4 a.m. when we heard a slight, sighing, moaning sound, and then the unmistakably heavy but softly muffled tread of a tiger on the carpet of fallen bamboo leaves that covered the sloping bank that faced us. Minutes passed, but we could see nothing in that Stygian darkness. Then we heard the distant sound of the lapping of water from the edge of the pool down below in the darkness and to our right. The time had come, and as previously agreed, I gently nudged Mac to take the shot. Pointing his rifle in the direction of the sound, while I kept ready for a covering shot if necessary, Mac depressed the torch switch, and the bright beam streamed down upon the form of an immense tiger crouched over the water's edge. The beast looked up, his eyes reflecting the light in two large, gleaming red-white orbs, and then Mac fired. There was a roar as the tiger sprang into the air to turn a complete somersault and fall over backwards, biting the ground and lashing out in a furious medley of bubbling, snarling growls. Mac followed up with 2 more shots before the tiger rolled over, half into the water, to twitch in the throes of approaching death, then to lie still. With the dawn, we descended to find that Mac had shot the male of the party. He was a truly magnificently proportioned tiger and a wonderful trophy. But we were all disappointed to know that the man-eater was still at large. Mac's first shot had struck the animal at the top of its nose, smashing the upper jaw and palate and passing into the throat, which accounted for the bubbling sound we had heard with its snarls. His second shot had passed through the right shoulder and into the abdomen. The third had missed. I will pass over the events of the next 4 days, during which no reports were received, and the local population began congratulating us on having slain the man-eater, the opinion of some being that it was the same tiger that had killed both man and cattle. But we knew better and lingered on, certain that sooner or later we would receive news of another human kill, unless, of course, the man-eater had left the area after the death of its companion. The nights of those 4 days we spent in driving along the road up to Chitaldrug and along all passable forest tracks in the hope of meeting the man-eater, but without success. Shortly before noon on the 5th day came the news we had feared but anticipated, in the form of 3 runners dispatched by the Amildar at Chitaldrug to acquaint us with the fact that late the previous evening a lad aged 14 years had been carried away by a tiger from a hamlet at the base of the southern slopes of the hillock of Yogi Mutt, which I have already told you lay to the south of the town of Chitaldrug itself and boasted an ancient, abandoned fort on its summit. Driving there by car, we visited the hamlet and were shown the small hut on its outskirts, from the very door of which the lad had been snatched at sundown the previous evening. As the country to the south of the hamlet was practically bare, there was good reason for believing, along with the inhabitants of the village, that the tiger had carried its victim up the hill and was probably at that moment sheltering in the ruins of the fort. No organized attempt at searching for the body had been made, and only 4 hours of daylight remained to us when we assembled a party of half a dozen men and began to climb the hill. It was soon apparent that the tiger had not carried its victim up the main footpath leading to the top of the hill, which we more than half ascended without finding a vestige or trace of the victim. Climbing neighboring boulders as we advanced, I instructed the men to look in all directions for anything that became visible, and when about 3/4 of the way up, one of these men reported vultures sitting in a tree about a 1/4 mile to our left. Scrambling along the intervening rocks and thorny bushes, we eventually came upon the remains of the boy, completely devoured by this time by the vultures. There appeared little use or hope in sitting up over the bones, especially as we knew from experience that the killer seldom returned to such a meal. Nevertheless, Mac and the 2 men put up my machan in the tree on which the vultures had been sitting and decided to remain there, while I felt I had just enough time to ascend the rest of the hill and look among the ruins. Regaining the path, I hurried upwards and reached the ruins just after 5 p.m. The walls of the fort had long since crumbled into decay, and a sea of lantana and thorny undergrowth covered the area as well as the old moat that lay outside. At this point, the remaining 4 men in the party elected to remain outside. To await my return, they ascended to the topmost branches of a tall fig tree, the gnarled roots of which bit deep into the debris of the fort's wall. Proceeding cautiously, I endeavored to keep on top of the fallen wall as far as it was negotiable in order to maintain some elevation above the surrounding lantana, which was both impassable as well as dangerous to enter, as I would not be able to see the tiger in that undergrowth even if it were but a yard away. Progress was most difficult and strenuous, and by the time I had reached the opposite end of the fort, I was breathing heavily from my exertions and bathed in perspiration. Here I faced the sun as the golden orb neared the western horizon. Years ago, I had been over the same fort, and I knew that about this spot were the almost completely engulfed remains of walled enclosures and what had been dungeons in the distant long ago. Because of these structures, the wall at this point becomes impossible to follow. I was loath to step down into the lantana, but it soon became apparent that I would either have to do this and struggle through a distance of about 100 yards to where the wall began again, or retrace my steps. Time was also against me, so to avoid delay, I finally decided to risk the lantana, which I commenced to push my way through as silently as I was able to. But this soon turned out to be impossible, for the lantana twigs, covered with minute thorns, clung to my clothing at each step and made considerable noise as I broke my way through. I knew I was now opposite the remains of the dungeons and enclosures, and that here, if anywhere in this deserted ruin, was where the tiger would most likely be hiding. At the same time, no doubt keyed up as I was by the unfavorableness of my position, my tensed nerves and senses signaled the proximity of danger. A sixth sense cried out that the tiger was near and on my trail, watching me for the moment of attack, which would take place very soon if I did not escape from the lantana. I had felt these warnings too often in my life to ignore them, so while trebling my vigilance and looking in all directions, I pressed forward to higher ground. 30 yards more, 20 yards more, 15 yards more, and then, from the lantana to my left, rose the snarling head of a tiger, its ears laid back in preparation for the spring, its jaws wide open to reveal the gleaming canines. My bullet crashed into the wide-open mouth as the animal launched itself forward. Rushing blindly on to gain higher ground, I all but lost my eyes in the intervening lantana, the thorns tearing my flesh and clothing, while pandemonium broke loose behind me. With the back of its head blown out, the tiger tried to get me, and when I had covered those remaining 15 yards and spun around, it was but 2 yards away, with a great, gaping red hole where half of its skull had once been. Almost beside myself with terror, I crashed a second, third, and fourth bullet into the beast, and as shattered, it toppled on its side. I sat down on a piece of the ruin, shaken, sick, and faint. 10 minutes later, I struggled to my feet, and avoiding the bloody mass before me, returned to the tree where I had left the 4 men by completing the circuit of the remaining fort wall. Hearing the 4 shots and the snarls of the tiger, they had concluded I had been killed, and were debating whether to come down from the tree and hasten back to their hamlet or spend the rest of the night in its branches. It was quite obvious they had never expected to see me alive again. Collecting them, we had hardly covered a furlong when we were met by Mac and the other 2 men. From where he was sitting, he too had heard my 4 shots, and like the staunch friend he was, had hurried forward to give any assistance I might need. As it was, seeing me tattered, scratched, and bleeding from my rush through the lantana, his ruddy face drained to a chalky white, and he ran forward to hold me, thinking I had been mauled. Squatting there, I told him what had happened, while I puffed clouds of smoke from my cherished briar, and received his warm congratulations. Indeed, I could not help remarking, as I smoked that soothing pipeful of tobacco, that I had never expected to smoke again when I saw that terrible face contorted with its lust to kill but a few feet away. Later that night, we carried the tiger down, hoisted it on the car, and took it to Chitaldrug town. As we had expected, it proved to be a female, and was undoubtedly the man-eater that had killed the boy. Its aggressiveness towards me also justified this conclusion. Early next morning, while skinning the animal, we were visited by the Amildar, who wanted to see the devil that had killed his relative, the little girl at Hosdurga, and by other district forest officials and hundreds of inhabitants. It was late that evening before we could leave for Bangalore, with the skins of the 2 tigers that had formed such an exceptional and unheard-of combination as a cattle killer and man-eater hunting together. Incidentally, skinning the tigress revealed no sign of the reason for her having become a man-eater. As I have already said, this district had a long history of man-eaters behind it, extending for generations past, and I am of the opinion that this tigress came of man-eating stock. Such an explanation would also account for her mate, the big male that Mac had shot, being a normal cattle lifter that had not touched human flesh. The tigress had probably only met this male during the mating season that was just over. It lasts from November to January, and had not been with him long enough to infect him with her man-eating habits. Had she littered, she would have undoubtedly have taught her cubs the taste for human flesh, just as she herself had been taught, and so have extended the generations of man-eaters of that district. The 3rd tiger, whose existence we had suspected, never materialized, for before leaving we left word with all the officials, as well as with the people, to inform us at once if a 3rd tiger was heard of. This was because we felt there was always the remote possibility that the 3rd tiger might also be the man-eater. But months passed, and we received the glad tidings that all reports of man-eating had ceased throughout the district after the killing of the tigress on the summit of Yogi Mutt. Fred Todd and the rest of her victims had been avenged. The end.